Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Jared Harris. Welcome to today's DevSecOps webinar. I am joined today with Scott Gerlach, co-founder and chief security officer at Stackhawk, Natasha Gupta, senior product marketing manager at Synopsys, Ron Vider, CTO and co-founder with Oxeye, Ritesh Patel, co-founder and VP of product with Nirmata, Robert Brennan, Director, Open Source Software with Fairwinds, Matt Fraunhofer. He is the Solutions Architect, XMatters, which is an Everbridge company. And today's moderator will be Mike Bazard, Chief Content Officer here at TechStrong with myself. Before we get started, I'd like to give you some housekeeping notes. This session is going to be recorded. You will be able to view this again at a later time, so feel free to ask questions at any time using the question box, which is on the right side of your screen. Questions will be answered throughout and at the end of the program. Any material, or there have been additional materials that have been provided to you. You can get those in the handouts tab. Lastly, be sure to stick around until the end of the program. There will be a $25 Amazon gift card drawing. At this time, I guess it's my pleasure to turn the program over to you, Mike. Go ahead and get started.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's going to be a great little panel here. I'd like to get started, though, with some fundamentals, because DevSecOps is a term. It kind of feels like, we split apart Dev and Ops, and then we threw some meat sandwich in between it and pushed it back together again and called it DevSecOps. And it's not clear to me that everybody completely has the same concept as to what that means or what it should mean. So I'm going to let Scott open up with you. What is your interpretation of what DevSecOps is or should be? And then maybe we'll see if we have a consensus on that.
Yeah, sure. What I think it is, and maybe it's not this way anymore, but the way I feel about it is the Agile Manifesto comes out and we're trying to figure out how to deliver software quickly to customers and end users. And DevOps comes out and we're like, hey, let's integrate this operations part of what we do into this development cycle so that we can quickly deliver all the way across the cycle. And security is off playing in their own swing set. And they're like, wait, those guys look like they're having fun. I want to be part of that, but we want to be in the middle and we want to interrupt everything. So DevSecOps. That's what I think it is today, or it feels like anyway. What I think it should be is security is part of operations and development, right? So it's part of the left side of the DevOps Mobius. It's part of the right side of the DevOps Mobius. It just is development and operations DevOps. But until everyone's kind of on the same page, I feel like DevSecOps is a thing that we need to keep reiterating to remind people, hey, security is part of this too. But, we don't call it like DevTestOps. We don't call it like DevOps monitoring. Like the things that are just part of this should be in DevOps. And I feel like security is trying to do that. But right now it's just kind of like a giant reminder in the middle.
Oh. Matt, picking up on that as a giant reminder in the middle. How much do you think that this is a conversation about actual technology versus cultures? And do we have to kind of figure out how to bridge both? Or is the tech side of this thing relatively trivial compared to the cultural side of this thing?
Oh, it's definitely trivial. I mean, the technology is there to do all sorts of things. The issue comes in on the actual application of it. And how do you transform an organization that has been doing things one way, or in many cases, several ways across the organization, and get them all moving in the same direction? DevSecOps and DevOps, whatever you want to call it, it is much more about culture and how you and the best practices that you should do, rather than the actual technologies that you need to have in order to successfully develop and produce software. That's just my take over the few years of doing this.
I agree that communication and culture is the bigger part of the story. I think where we're lacking in terms of technology is technology to help enable that communication, right? To help the developers see security findings as they're making a pull request that are the same security findings that the security team is going to see down the line once their application actually goes into production. If there's no consistency there in terms of what the developers see at pull request time and what the security folks see after deployment, then it's hard for that loop to be closed, and you end up having to play catch up with the security team going back to the dev team and annoying them, saying you got to fix this. And so that's where I think the technology kind of needs to catch up, is to enable that communication.
Well, I mean, I think there are several solutions out there that actually embed those security findings directly into the IDE. I think the challenge is it's hard for a dev team to go get funding for a security tool when accountants and other management takes a look at it and says, well, that's what our security team is for, right?
Yeah.
Well,
for sure.
Kind of, but not really.
Yeah. Ron, you've been around the block a couple of times as a CTO, and you probably lead teams that have folks from both sides of this equation. What is the challenge? I mean, in theory, we're all on the same team and possibly maybe even hoping for the same outcome, but something clearly happens between these two camps. So what is it? Is it a psychological issue, or what's going on between these two developers and security folks?
Yeah, so first of all, I say I like to call it SecDevOps, because I believe that security should come first. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the combination between the development of the application and the fact that we are making it more secure. So in addition, as part of the shift left movement, we do see a growth in the responsibility about security in the dev teams. So I believe that DevSecOps is the result of that thing.
All right. Ritesh, do you want to jump in here at all? I mean,
absolutely. And I think, I agree with Robert and Matt. I'm going to get dev and DevOps and, security. They need to be kind of intertwined, or, security needs to be part of every, step of your dev cycle, right? And obviously there are tools that enable that, but ultimately it comes to, roles and responsibilities, right? Do developers feel comfortable, identifying and addressing those security issues? Do they know what to do? Do they have all the visibility they need? And are they empowered to do all of that, right? So it really comes down to that culture that as a company that is set to kind of provide that freedom and responsibility to developers, and then and empower them, with the tools they need to make it happen.
All right, Natasha, we've been talking about DevSecOps for a while now. So what's changing that's making this front and center issue for folks out there? We hear a lot more about managing software supply chains, but is something fundamentally changing out there that you're seeing among customers and developers and security people, where that which was maybe, shall we say, an aspiration is becoming a necessity?
Well, I think it comes back to contextually, what are some of the major security events that have really rocked a lot of what's driving regulatory scrutiny and the priorities and the budgets of a lot of the key decision makers. Just recently, as of last weekend, you had a huge ransomware attack, for example, that happened to the San Francisco 49ers. You've had Log4j. You've had, the proliferation of a lot of costly reputation loss that's happened in the form of these cyber attacks, directly kind of taking advantage of how agile kind of software development sometimes overlooks the security component and integrating that. And so that does focus a lot of that scrutiny on, well, how are we baking security into the process? And I'd actually challenge, some of what that developer mindset has to be shifted towards is not necessarily maybe saying, as a developer, I have to think about security, but maybe reframing it as I have to think about software quality. And as interrelated kind of parts of the stakeholders who are involved in building quality software, how am I connecting my stakeholders, not just across development and security, but across compliance, across procurement? How do all of them have both consolidated visibility, a consolidated ways of communicating defects directly, having visibility of what is my risk exposure, what is the extent of which I have vulnerable software, and where is that vulnerable software? So I think that a lot of that contextualization and the fact that the attack surface has also expanded greatly with a lot of these orgs moving towards cloud infrastructure is really refocusing why DevSecOps is part of taking a very layered approach to tackling the extent to which your risk exposure exists.
Hey, Scott, since she brought it up, I'm going to throw that one right in your lap. But why are we talking about security like it's separate from QA these days? And can we, assume security just kind of be a function of QA?
I mean, security has a role in how we operate as a business today. And its role is as oversight, right? We like to say everyone's responsible for security. Insofar as everyone's responsible for making sure the bathroom looks nice when we all had offices to go to, but we are aware that the security team is accountable, like the janitorial staff is accountable for making sure the bathroom. You know what I mean? It's different. So I think there's a ton of like customer requirements driving this need to do security during the development lifecycle. People are asking, how are you doing secure software development? Having a good story about what you're doing there is important. Software engineers being able to inform themselves about best practice. And this is where security comes in. What's best practice? How do I self-serve? How do I make decisions and document them for myself? And then have the security team be consultants about security, which is what they're really good at. They're not really good at keeping up, scaling out with the engineering organization, trying to go, hey, the engineering organization's hiring 10 people, so I need 2 security people. It doesn't work and never will, because there's not that many security people. And the budget for that is going to be 0. But being able to facilitate kind of that trust and verify mantra that security is supposed to have, let people do things, make smart decisions, be able to review and recount or have discussions about those decisions if they disagree with them or think about them differently, or instead of like here comes a FedEx envelope with a 13-page PDF that we've got to go fix all this stuff now because we just found it. That's the wrong way. Being able to, like people have said here, being able to know about this stuff as you're writing code, as you're making PRs, and be able to self-serve the decisions is super important so that people don't just go, well, I can't self-serve. This thing is blocking me. I'm going to rip it out or go around it.
Yeah.
So just Mike, quick to add to that, right? I mean, this is exactly where, technology can help, right? If you have security teams that kind of understand, and are able to provide those best practices, there are tools that can help ensure and enforce those best practices, right? As teams are moving quickly and building out their software, there are several opportunities for them to take shortcuts, right? And how do you ensure that they don't? So this is where technology can come in and provide those necessary guardrails or oversight or whatever you want to call it, but just not leave it up to developers to do the right thing, but also guide them and make sure that if they are not, or they're kind of crossing a line, they're made aware of it.
All right. Robert, what is the ability of developers to do the right thing, right? We are talking lately about things like log4j shell, and we have these issues where it's really a small development team that worked on that. They're not security experts. And a lot of the open source people will say, hey, I gave you free software. It's up to you to figure out how to secure it. So there's that aspect of the conversation. So what can we realistically expect of developers to know about security, or do we have to find some other way to go after this thing?
Yeah, it's definitely super important to educate development teams about security, about how to write code that's not buggy, about how to investigate the open source projects that they're looking to include as dependencies, to see, is this just it's got 2 stars on GitHub and nobody else has ever used it, or like, is this a popular project that's well known, well supported? They're going to fix vulnerabilities. I think all these things are super important to educate developers on. But I don't think you can, always know that they're going to make the right decisions all the time. People make mistakes, and it's not, part of what they're judged on. Basically, developers are judged on whether they ship features, whether those features have bugs or not. But typically, vulnerabilities are not they're kind of a black swan event. So it's hard to incentivize teams properly around secure code. So it's super important to have automated scanning in place to push feedback towards the developers early on in the development cycle, to make sure that they have those types of findings front and center, and they can kind of keep themselves honest.
Matt, do you think the ops team has a role to play in helping developers, quote unquote, keep themselves honest in terms of what software they're using, what components, how sustainable it really is?
I mean, in an ideal world, operations is sitting there next to the developers while they're writing it. I mean, when you're writing the code that you're writing, you should know in what environment it's actually going to run in. And so I can design around that environment. All too often we see, and this kind of speaks, I think, to the broader goal of DevOps, is that oftentimes development's developing in their little world, in their test environments, and then hand it over to the separate production team who puts it in a completely separate environment and finds all these bugs in it. Well, why didn't operations communicate? Operations and development should constantly be going back and forth, making sure that, if operations is going to run it in a Kubernetes-based environment, the development team should know about that and be able to make sure that they're developing in that. If they're going to run it behind a firewall, then they should be running it in a firewall. You should have all of those pieces known and changing your development environment as required to facilitate the development there. And of course, if operations finds that, say, Log4j has a vulnerability, they need to feed that back as soon as they can to the development team so that they can be aware and potentially try to mitigate it as fast as they can.
I totally
Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Robert and Matt just said. There is a lot about education and the context, like you found a vulnerability where it is inside your environment. And I think one of the most important thing in order to do it in the best way was to focus on the thing that actually matters. Like both Mike and Matt mentioned earlier, Log4j. And I think Log4j was in Christmas Eve, and many organizations had tons of Log4j instances. And in order to make the developers do their work best, especially in the security perspective, was like, let's talk about Log4j. Start with the vulnerability that is exposed to the internet, the ones that create the highest risk on the application, and then they will be able to manage security in the best way.
Natasha, let me ask you a follow-up on that. As a variation of an old joke, but the only thing a developer and an ops guy can agree on usually is that they don't think much of the intelligence of the security team. So question then becomes to you is, how do security people have a more meaningful engagement with the development team other than, putting together that large PDF that Scott described and shipping it over? But how do you kind of get in there and say, well, yeah, these are the ones we need to prioritize because they have the most impact in the environment, or is that not the job of the security team in the first place, and somebody else needs to figure out what's real and what's not?
Well, I think it comes back to both the security team and development team, ops team, all have a very valuable point of context that they add to the total question. And I see that one of the problems we hear from customers is, well, I'm using a lot of scanning tools currently. I have a lot of investment in AppSec, but my security team cannot take the kind of time that the turnaround that it takes to quickly escalate a finding, sort through this barrage of rich security data that I'm getting, much of which I can have results duplicated between different tools. For example, I don't know what is the most important work to escalate to a developer. And meantime, on a developer's end, they are having to kind of manually keep up with that level of trying to figure out, okay, do I have the context that I need to be able to prioritize my most critical work? There is an element of this also that developers add a very important piece of information to triaging a security question, which is they understand for the extent of a security issue, how does this affect, for example, the environment that this feature or this product is deployed? How does this affect subsequent, other parts of my product that could be affected by me changing this particular security issue? And so to answer your question, I think the level of visibility that's required to kind of get every stakeholder, sort of unified on how to best resolve kind of mitigating your level of software risk and managing your AppSec investment wisely is you need to have a way to have an intelligent sort of sorting of all of that data. You need to be able to take whatever results you have of the security tooling you're using. You need to have a way to correlate those results, normalize those results, filter out duplicated findings. And you need to have a way of intelligently gleaning from a lot of this historical data, what is my most impactful security activity? Because I think back to what Robert was saying earlier, that the developer is purely focused on my fastest way to get to producing a feature, to meeting certain kinds of production standards that I have to meet and SLAs I have to meet. And their mindset is not necessarily first, let me look for every given security flaw that my code has, right? My source code has. And the security team has a certain directive that I have to make sure that whatever we produce as product meets up to that level of regulatory scrutiny that is passed down to our team by the compliance team, that we are able to measure up to, having mitigated that level of software risk that we have, right? And so, and getting that data passed down as to the right stakeholders, in the most consolidated way. And so it's important to have a single platform to get that visibility, and that context and that data is sorted in a way that is consolidated, it makes sense, and it's intelligent based on that level of business context and kind of overall risk context that you have. It takes into account CWE. It takes into account, what is the criticality of the data that app handles. It takes into account other dependencies that you may have, when running an additional scan, an additional test. And the level of work it takes to remediate that level of security defect or issue. That's the kind of visibility to get these teams to effectively kind of collaborate together and really try and kind of achieve that sort of DevSecOps utopia that we're talking about.
All right, Ron, I want to run this question from one of the audience members by you because it kind of speaks to this whole issue a little bit. But Shantaram K notes that part of the problem with shifting things to the left is the developer can't replicate the production environment. The production environment's too large. So they are kind of wholly dependent upon the ops team or the security team to tell them what to prioritize and what needs to be fixed and to provide that visibility. So is that kind of the thing that we're overlooking here when we say shift left, when in reality, it's almost impossible for a developer to fully shift left?
So organizations need to secure their application across the entire software development lifecycle. It's not enough just to make sure the production is safe, or it's not enough to make sure you don't have third-party components vulnerable straight in your IDE. But I would say that shifting to left may create noise, like the example you just mentioned. And when you shift left too much, you're probably missing the context. And we talked about that earlier. Log4Shell is a good example. If you have shifted to left, you don't know exactly what is the real risk per each instance. Some of them exposed to the internet, some of them are not. And maybe you have a Log4j instance with high privileged container, or what is the permissions in the Kubernetes environment. So this kind of information you can get only when you're not that shift left. You still have to stretch right a bit.
Yeah. Ritesh, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what he's saying is that instead of shifting left, perhaps the organization just needs to lean left.
Yeah, I mean, again, shift left does not mean you do everything right, up, early in your development cycle, right? There's going to be always cases like, the example in the question. I mean, you cannot always replicate your production environment, right? If your production environment it's a large environment, has all kinds of configuration. I mean, a lot of that cannot be replicated. So shifting left should involve, I mean, you need to really think about what all can be done earlier in the dev cycle, right? Like making sure your code is scanned, making sure your entire if you're using containers and images, ensuring that those are packaged correctly, there are no vulnerabilities there. But there are certain things that you have to do at runtime which need a specific environment, may not be the right, may not be possible in this case.
All right. Well, since we're down this path, there's another question from Sandro G that I'm going to give to Scott here, but he's kind of pointing out, I'm assuming that's a he, I could be wrong. If we're so dependent upon the right side to give us information and insights, are we not committing some form of DevOps heresy because we're not automating things and we have these separate roles? And how do we bring all this stuff together in a way that is cohesive with the DevOps tenets that we all know and love?
Yeah, I was looking at this thread in the chat out here, and Sandro makes a good point. If you're talking about an ops guy and their responsibility to inform development about what the operation environment looks like, you're not doing DevOps. That's not DevOps at all. If you're waiting for a security team member to inform you about what the security impact, you're not doing DevOps. You're doing old school development, pass off to operations, pass off to security. That's not DevOps. DevOps is you have some specialist, some SRE that understands operations and provides tooling and information to the development team to instrument and deploy that operation environment. Now they're deeply involved in what the operational environment looks like across all of the environments. Same thing with the security team. Security team is supposed to be developing tooling and processes that help a development team informationalize what they need to know about when they need to know about it. None of these roles should be a checkpoint anywhere in the development lifecycle or a DevOps lifecycle. DevOps is about doing all of this stuff as a team, not as separate teams. There's no operations team. There's not a specific development team that doesn't interact with each other. So, Sandro's point here is really good about like making sure that this team is working together to get the tooling and information in the right place to make decisions and configurations early so that it is highly repeatable, highly informationalized. And so, if you think about when are we saying log4j or log4j? I don't know which one you're saying. I'm going log4j today. You think about the operations or the development teams that have this good, we're talking about software inventory, SBOMs, all that good stuff. Talking about the security teams that have helped inform those teams, what they have, where they have it, when they have it, all that good stuff. For those teams, when Log4Shell came out, that was not actually a fire drill of any kind of consequence. They went, I know where I have Log4j running. I know what version I have, and I know if I can upgrade it or not, because bumping a version, rebuilding it, running unit tests, I'm in good shape. I've deployed. It was actually a much less fire drill than a lot of other stuff that we've seen in history has ever been. Where people struggle is, I don't know where I have Log4j running. I don't know what criticality it is. And that's because these teams aren't integrated and not doing DevOps, in my opinion.
Yeah. Matt, you good with that? Should we just blow up the org chart and just bring everybody together, and we don't need separate ops guys and dev guys and security people. It's just one big happy family.
You know, in theory, it sounds great, but I'm going to go a little bit contrarian and say that in larger organizations, it's almost impossible to actually achieve that. Now, I think depending on how an organization runs, there's definitely pockets of it, but I don't believe it's 100% feasible to get with to have that kind of blow up the org chart mentality in a larger, more traditional organization. Now, I think about as you go through and as a organization matures, we have to also remember DevSecOps is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And so anything you can do to get better and better and better is ultimately what you want to be striving for. And I think that is a practice that a lot of organizations are forgetting about in all of this. They want to implement the tools and say, yep, checkbox, we're done. We're DevSecOps because we do CI/CD and cross it off our list and let's move on to the next thing. DevOps is ultimately a journey, not a destination. You have to do that continuous improvement throughout your journey to always be trying to streamline, trying to change up how your organization is structured. And so maybe you can get to that point where all the roles on the team are all on one team and you don't have separate groups. But if your organization isn't set up for that, there are not enough people out there that understand this to be able to convince the people that don't that that's the right way. And so ultimately it's you got to just keep making progress.
Yeah. Natasha, sorry, go ahead.
I would just quickly add to Matt's point that he brings up something really valid, that it's very organizationally dependent. And for example, some of the customers we've talked to, where you could have this large organization that's kind of a patchwork of acquisitions. Every team is sort of coming in with their own tooling. The question of DevSecOps becomes very different for that level of security visibility that you need to have, because every team is kind of operating in their own silos of what they do for security, what type of visibility do they have, and you don't have like kind of that global perspective of what my level of software risk is. You have, in contrast, like when we have talked to smaller customers, you've got maybe a dedicated security champion on a development team that is vetting the tooling, that is vetting the types of protocols that of promoting kind of a secure coding culture within their team. But I think either situation you have in this, I think something important to bring up is you need kind of a continuous improvement model for how you implement DevSecOps. So if you're running static analysis, you find, let's say 13 SQL, injection violations in your code. You have to be able to have a way of understanding what builds does this affect the most? What what were the commits that were made where we started seeing this issue more and more? Being able to have like kind of that level of being able to pinpoint where my most vulnerable software is. And what can happen a lot of the time is with larger organizations that kind of have that coupling with maybe legacy AppSec infrastructure that they're using, maybe a patchwork of different tooling, is that level of granularity is sometimes not accomplished. And that's why DevSecOps initiatives, while you can have that level of automation in pushing defects directly to developers through maybe different scanning tools that you've implemented, that level of granularity in terms of overall risk visibility is something that is missing from the equation. If you don't have a way to kind of unify a lot of that data coming in, and being able to concretely see the source of your most vulnerable software.
Hey, Robert, we had this executive order from the President of the United States It was like, I don't know, 3 pages long. I think I just read it over the weekend at some point, end to end. But essentially it says that, thou shalt do DevSecOps if you're a federal agency. Do you think that other organizations and enterprises are going to follow suit along that path, and everybody, regardless of where they start or what they think the journey is, are we going to see more people going down this path just because somebody at the top of the organization, in this case, the commander-in-chief, said, this is what we're doing?
Yeah, there's I think you do get like kind of a trickle down security effect from something like this, where if those very large organizations, which do have large budgets and buy a lot of software, are forced to adhere to certain security standards, a lot of their vendors are then going to be forced to adhere to those standards. The vendors eventually end up having to adhere to certain standards. So it definitely weakens over, as you go further down the chain. But I think it does kind of help to set up a goalpost saying, okay, here's what, the U.S. government considers secure practices, et cetera. And that kind of sets a new bar for everybody else to kind of aim for.
All right. Assuming that this is a government agency, that a private enterprise should exceed that bar, right? Because, the government, God bless all those people. They live in a level of bureaucracy that's difficult, and they may not even get paid as much as everybody else. So maybe that's the new bar. Is that unfair?
No, I think that's very fair. And I've worked a lot with federal agencies, and it is for the executive order to say we do DevSecOps, there's going to be a lot of checking boxes to make sure they meet the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And so that's ultimately the challenge with all of this is I can implement all the check boxes and still have issues. None of this is a silver bullet. None of this is actually going to accomplish a whole lot until mindsets change, and especially that the business or the agency and what we would consider the business adopts some of these same philosophies. Security should be embedded as part of the planning process so that they at least know. All too often they're off in their own little corner and only brought in at the very tail end of everything. I want security in the room while I'm trying to plan out what this application is going to do, because they're going to lend a different perspective. You need different perspectives to ultimately get to the secure application that we're all wanting. But all too often, security and other quote unquote maintenance items, they get pushed to the side in favor of features and functionality that inherently aren't designed securely because we need it in 2 weeks.
So Joanne brought up this question as well, and I guess I'll kick this over to Scott, since I know security people have been dealing with this forever. But what is the role of legal and compliance in this whole process? And for that matter, is compliance kind of, shall we say, not the best way to go about it, because it does create this bare minimum, and that's not usually secure enough by definition. So how do we kind of change the mindset, and where does the compliance people fit in that conversation?
Yeah, I think compliance, let's talk about legal first, because running around with the SOC 2 hammer or the PCI hammer or the Sarbanes-Oxley hammer is never a good, I've done it. Like, I've done that. It's not a good look. Gets stuff done, but it's not sustainable over long periods of time. But let's talk about the legal team a little bit. Their whole job is helping the business manage risk, right? They're doing contract evaluation and going, this contract and this language in this contract puts the business at risk. Now let's make a decision about what we should do about it. That's their job. That's security's job too, in a different context. Their context is about information security and a little bit about reputation, business reputation, like helping the business understand what risks are we about to take or not take, and helping the product teams, product delivery teams understand that risk is really important and what they're supposed to be doing, not stamping yes, stamping no's, when we talk about, I just had to add this, when we're talking about the federal government shifting to a DevSecOps, all I can think about is the Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal. That's the only thing I can think about when we're like, yeah, let's just insta pivot large government organizations. Jammed. Anyway, sorry.
All right. Hey, Ron, I'm going to throw this at you because, and I'll give credit to Shantaram K for bringing this up as well. But sometimes you talk to developers, and the reason they get to like DevOps as a concept is they think that they're going to programmatically write the ops, security, and maybe compliance people out of existence, and they just want to write code and kind of end run the whole process. So is that feasible, possible, or is that maybe a daydream?
So I think until recently, it wasn't one of the responsibility of developers to make sure that application were secured, and giving them additional thing they have to be in charge on potentially will make them to deliver their task slower. So I think this is one of the main reasons why they seem to resist it. But in the end of the day, they also want to make sure their apps are secure, because like if they will get into a breach or a security incident, in the end of the day, they will deliver it slower. So in the short term, yeah, they will resist and won't necessarily would like to use it. But on the long term, it's good for them and they will understand it. So they will use this kind of solution in their development lifecycle.
All right. Ritesh, what do you think? Is it possible to automate all this stuff to a level where the developer can handle it? Or is that part of this journey we're headed on?
Well, the truth is... Oh, I'm sorry. Was that was for Ritesh? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ritesh.
We'll start with Ritesh and we'll come right to you right after. How's that?
Yeah. So I was just going to say that, again, automating this is one thing, but the question is who automates it, right? Again, and we talk about developers broadly, right? But then there are developers who are working on applications. There are developers who are working on infrastructure as code. And then there can be developers from, security and operations side working on policies as code and, codifying as much as possible, right? So I think codifying things definitely help, but it's not going to be the same developer, the one who's in charge of features and product necessarily who does everything. I think that's something to keep in mind. They may provide hooks into their application, right? Now, more and more applications can export metrics so that, there's more visibility across the board, things of that nature. But expecting them to kind of code across everything is probably unrealistic.
Natasha, you want to add to that?
I definitely agree. And I think one of, if I can provide one analogy to kind of what, automation versus manual review kind of means in the, totality of the process, think of kind of when you're painting a wall, using a roller brush as opposed to a paintbrush. The truth is you need both. You need that kind of approach of syncing sort of that continuous feedback model of being able to communicate defects directly to developers, having a way for them to automatically be able to derive that level of decision making, whether you're using, let's say, machine learning to, ascertain triage results or et cetera. But you need that paintbrush, which is you need that level of manual review when it comes to exceptions and when it comes to a certain level of developer context that, let's say, I know how specifically this feature is going to be deployed, or I know, specific environments that, if I commit that particular change, it'll affect the functionality of my product, right? That is the level of developer context that maybe, that level of granularity that can't be covered necessarily by automation is something we need to account for in kind of what it means to effectively set up a DevSecOps that kind of works for exceptions and for counter cases.
All right, Matt, you're on the ops side. Do you think that these days, at least, you cannot turn around with somebody saying they have an algorithm for this or an AI thing for that will solve all our issues? So can we use AI to save us from ourselves in this context at some point? Is that a hope? Is that part of the journey, or is that wishful thinking?
I think today it's a lot of wishful thinking. I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement of roles versus persons fulfilling that role. So to the comment about dev teams developing in such a way that they don't need ops anymore, I mean, you're always going to have ops. The question is who's actually doing and fulfilling that job, because you need somebody to operate the solution. Now, if I can automate it to the point that maybe it takes up less of their time, great. But you're still going to have somebody that understands that operational automation and the operational aspects of running this application in a production environment. You can't just take away the human aspect of it, because there will be things that come up that you can't predict. Now, will AI catch up? I'm not an AI expert. Maybe, very possibly, but we also have to remember humans are the one that train the models, and we're fallible. So I'm not one that is that's apt to say, yeah, we're going to be able to hand it over to the robot overlords.
All right. Well, as one guy reminded me, he said, it's one thing to be wrong. It's quite another thing to be wrong at scale. So that's the problem with AI. Robert, way back when, there's a fellow named Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe in Any Speed, and he was beaten up on the automotive industry for the lack of guardrails and safety controls that were leading to all these accidents. And that led to some curbing of the highway rate of speed, at least momentarily. Are we doing the same thing in software development? Are we building software too fast today, and it is unsafe because we don't have the guardrails in place? And do we need to slow down, or can we keep going as fast but do it better?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really like triggered the growth in speed of open source and the growth and speed of development has been the growth of the open source community. The fact that I can now, launch a production ready application with, pulling off a bunch of like off the shelf frameworks and things like that. I can use Kubernetes as all open source. It's just, I can do so much more even as an individual developer today than I could do, 10 years ago. And like you said, it's much easier for me to do things wrong at scale now. So I think we don't really have yet the tooling we need, the technology we need to manage all that open source. If I look in my own environment, I would say out of the code that's running in my Kubernetes cluster, I probably own or wrote, my company owns or wrote probably 1% to 10% of that code. 90% of it, at least, is open source code. It's the core Kubernetes code. It's Nginx Ingress and Cert Manager and all these open source tools that we rely on. And, we don't control those projects. If there are vulnerabilities there, we can't just go in and fix them. We have to trust those teams to fix them. And we really just don't have the tools and process in place, or we're only kind of just getting them in place, as a engineering community, to kind of wrap our arms around all that code and understanding where it comes from, whether we can trust it, to what degree we can trust it, all that. So there's definitely a need for a cultural shift around how do you manage all of this third-party code, all this open source code.
All right, Scott, do you think we need to slow down? I know the security guys that I talk to sure wish they would, but I don't know how realistic that is.
No. I have a really great analogy here. So early in my career, I spent a lot of time working at GoDaddy. GoDaddy did a lot of racing sponsorship. If you look at what happens in racing, whether it's NASCAR or F1 or whatever kind of racing, there are teams that help put together the things that keep people safe, right? Keep the people that come and pay money, the spectators, from dying so that they can come back and pay more money. Their job is to keep the spectators safe and the drivers safe. So you have that like whole safety crew that helps the whole like design of safer barriers and head restraints and the crash, the roll cage on the car. Their whole job is to help those race cars go faster. That's what our job should be. Our job should be to set up those processes and procedures and tools and kind of Robert was mentioning guardrails, but things that help us go faster in our lane. And also, when something goes wrong, we don't fling debris off into the crowd and wreck a bunch of spectators and all kinds of stuff. That is our whole job, is to help everyone go faster, because when the company goes faster, they have faster time to realize value with customers and generate more revenue quickly. And that's the whole point. The whole point is to do exactly that, is to generate revenue. And our job is to help the company understand how to do that quickly, safely, and be good improv partners in our yes and kind of mantra.
All right, cool.
So,
all right, guys,
Mike,
go ahead. Sorry.
Just one comment to kind of piggyback off of what Robert was saying. There's also the idea, the analogy or the example he gave of 90% of the code in their production Kubernetes cluster is made up of open source contributions. We have incredibly large organizations out there that are utilizing people's work and basically some of their free time to develop these projects, and they're putting it out in open source world, and then companies are using it to build their products and their profits and not contributing anything back in terms of maintenance. And so at what point do we need to be better citizens of the open source community and enable those teams and those people to actually go back in and fix it? Because if say I'm one of the Log4j developers on that relatively small team, if I have a day job that I'm constantly working and Log4j is my side project, if everybody's depending on me for that bug fix and to fix those security vulnerabilities, I need some sort of ability to financially switch from, well, I have to have this day job so I can pay my bills and everything. I need to be able to shift more of my time to this thing that is now critical to the entire technology infrastructure of the world. And so what do our corporate partners have in terms of a responsibility there?
All right, we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. Okay. Ron, what's your best advice to folks as you because there's a lot to boil here, and if you just jump in, you might wind up boil the ocean. But where do you get started? What's do you do this from the bottom up? Do you do this from the top down? How do you tell people to get this ball rolling?
Yeah, so I would say that the way application looks like changed dramatically in the past years. Like the shift to cloud native and the DevOps era, all of these things changed the way developers are working, how we deploy code to production, and how the entire ecosystem looks like. And so my best advice is that when we are trying to secure this kind of application or environments, we must use tools that are relevant for these types of environments, that are aligned with the modern architectures that exist out there in the wild. So I think my best advice is to make sure that the tools you are using are relevant and fit to the environment that you are working in.
All right. Natasha, do you want to add anything to that? Because to his point, giving developers a bunch of graphical tools aimed at security people might not get you very far, right?
I think the tools are one part of it, but there's another side to it of not just testing, but making that testing meaningful and intelligent. If you commit let's say a minor CSS page change of changing the color of a font, okay, I don't think we need to run another round of static testing or secure code analysis there. But if you've got to change to your authentication and authorization measures, yeah, sure. You'd have to be able to quickly, be able to ascertain that level of decision making. So I just add to Ron's point that make your security activities meaningful and have the means to do that. Have a means to consolidate the greatest value out of your tools. And the way you do that is both having a way to coordinate that testing intelligently. And the second part of it is being able to make meaningful sense of that data you're getting from your current AppSec tools, which for various reasons, you're probably invested in many. You've got, a variety of AST tools across, SAST, DAST, et cetera. Those are giving you relevant kinds of data with respect to the kind of software flaws you're looking for, the kind of programming languages the vendors are compatible with, the kind of environments it works for. Make that investment, but be able to get intelligent insight out of that data by investing in a solution that can help you get there.
Ritesh, do you agree with that? Because some folks would say you need to start with the process, including some of the people who are on the panel here with the presenters and doing the Q&A. And then you got to change that first and then find the tools. Other people would say if you give them the tools, the culture will eventually change to reflect the way the tools work. It's a chicken and an egg. Which way do you think we should go?
I really feel it's the culture, right? I mean, culture is where it needs to start, and tools just support that transition. If you don't have that culture, if folks are not they don't buy into this paradigm, then I don't think tools are going to work. I mean, it's you really find it hard to get people to use those tools. So really, culture, and starting with the culture, starting with making sure everybody is on board, everybody is committed, believes in this transition to DevOps and DevSecOps. And like somebody mentioned earlier, it's a journey, right? So it's not a transition that may bear results maybe 3 months down the line, but maybe a year or two down the line. And the leaders need to kind of understand that. I mean, just like this digital transformation and architectural transformation from monolith to microservices, all of those have been journeys in the past, over the past few years. DevSecOps transition is a journey, and having the right people in place, having the right culture in place will help them ensure that they're successful in the journey. I mean, tools will play a part along the way to make sure that people can do their jobs efficiently, but culture is where it starts.
All right, well, we'll see. I mean, you could argue that DevOps is a bridge, and the military has a maxim about the best way to take a bridge is from both sides at the same time. So tools and culture together might make it all come together. One or the other, you might take a little bit longer. We'll see. Hey, I want to thank you all for spending some time listening to this panel. It was awesome. You guys were terrific. Your insights were tremendous. And as I promised, an hour flew by before you even knew it. Jared, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right. I want to thank everyone for today's program, all your comments. I didn't see any questions in the question chat. There was quite a bit of chat amongst everyone. That's great. I like to see that. And just want to set a reminder for everybody, this program has been recorded. You will be able to view it again. Give us a little time and we'll send you out an email with instructions on how to do so to watch the on-demand version. You can also go to techstrong.com, devops.com, containerjournal.com, Security Boulevard to view this again as well. I'd like to announce today's gift card winners. We've got Noah L, Sophia C, Scott H, and Shanthram K. Congratulations to our Amazon gift card winners. We'll be sending you instructions on how to claim your gift card. So keep an eye out on your inbox, also your spam filter, spam folder. And thank you again for everybody for joining us and engaging in today's program, DevSecOps. Thank you again. Have a great day. And I am signing out.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.